billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Yes, as Miqdad said, I'm not sure I'm young anymore, but anyway, young person giving a talk on what happened to British education. Education is something that's very important to all of us. I mean, if we have children, our children will be going through the education system. If we will ourselves have been through the education system as well. So what I wish to talk about today is the history of the British education system. So I won't be able to cover everything in the history of British education. I'll start from 1944 with the 1944 Education Act that made education compulsory up to the age of 15, and we'll then hopefully move on to the present. Then we want to look at the ideologies behind educational policy. This is in particular the last 30 to 40 years since Margaret Thatcher. We're going to look at the kind of ideologies that shaped the educational policy that was produced then and is still being produced at this point today. And then we finally want to end by looking at what the outcomes are of these ideologies. So what do these ideologies mean to us? Why do we need to look at them? Why are they important? What happens when we apply these ideologies to education? So we start at the 1944 Education Act. In this act, the head of the NUT, after it was released, asked the question, does it wipe out class discrimination? Does it promise for the average child something better than the disgracefully low standards of the ordinary elementary school? Does it contain any advance towards equality of opportunity? And Giles answered this question by saying it was a drastic recasting of our educational system. It split our education into three sections. It gave us primary education, secondary education, and further education in a shape that we still have to this day. The nature of the child's education was now going to be based on his capacity and his promise rather than just on the circumstance of his parents. So it was no longer, they thought, going to be based on class. It was going to be based on how much the student was able to produce. It made education compulsory up to the age of 15, and it was intended to make education compulsory up to the age of 16 as soon as possible after. This unfortunately didn't happen until 1972, so it was only compulsory up to the age of 15. They also wanted to introduce compulsory part-time education for 16 and 18-year-olds, but again, this was never something that was realized. And actually, what it did promise was to create a tripartite system of secondary education. This was a system that split education into three sections, into grammar schools, technical schools, and modern schools. This was secondary education we were talking about. What would happen is students would sit an exam at the age of 11, known as the 11 plus exam, which was essentially an IQ test. And from the results of this exam, they would then be either put into a modern school where the students were supposedly interested in things as they are, so it was more of a vocational education, or they would be put into a technical school where they applied some of the information that had been produced in things like applied science or applied arts, or they would be put into a grammar school, which was where they actually looked at the actual science and the actual arts in what was considered to be an academic education. And out of these three schools, they were left to the LEAs, the local educational associations, to set them up, and only 52 technical schools in the whole of UK were ever set up. So really, technical schools were not an option. You could either go to a modern school or a grammar school. There was also a fourth option, which was the option of comprehensive schools. These were also allowed in the 1944 Education Act. They were state-funded, but they didn't have any selection. Pupils from all abilities were allowed to go into the comprehensive school. But there were only very few that opened. 26 of these were opened by 1958. So we started this act in 1944. In the duration of 14 years, we only had 26 comprehensives started up. So really, the options for secondary education at the time were moderns or grammars. What these modern schools were, in a little more detail, they were described by Quinton Hogg, the Secretary of State, in 1964 as being, when he went to visit them, he said, there was a pleasant noise of banging metal and sawing wood, and also a smell of cooking with rather expensive cooking equipment. A very vocational education. And then, as it was described a little bit later by Taylor, the historian, he said, run away to sea rather than going to a secondary modern. They were at best second best, and they were a complete disaster, as was described later. So, the Educational Act of 1944, although having some promise, ended up sinking into a system of just two categories, either being put into a modern, which didn't do much to improve your opportunities, or being put into a grammar school. And as we see, the number of people going into a grammar school, we have 59 to 68% of people from a middle class background, with 14 to 18% from a working class background. So essentially the class divides were not being challenged, and we basically had middle class students going mainly to grammar schools, the working or the lower class going to moderns, and the rich ending up going into private education, and some of them also into grammar schools. There were not enough places in grammar schools for everyone to be sent there. In 1960, 1 in 8 students from a secondary modern was actually able to achieve an O-level pass. So 1 in 8 students in 1960. In 1965, the government then decided to introduce a certificate of secondary education, the CSE, because so few of them were passing the O-level. So the CSE was created as an examination because as a second examination, as a lower ability examination, because the O-levels were considered too difficult for these students. So this had to be addressed, and in 1965 there was something called the Circular 1065 was released, which requested all of the LEAs to move to comprehensive schools. Again, because it was just a request, it wasn't something that they had to do, it wasn't actually carried out, and it wasn't until 1976 when the Labour government made it compulsory to move to comprehensives that we actually see this move. So in 1965, we've got 8.5% of the population being educated in comprehensives. In 1970, it goes up to 40%. In 1973, 50%. By 1977, we then begin to see 80% of the population being educated in comprehensives, before 1981, where it's 83%. And the number of grammar schools, because of this change, also went down. In 1960, you had 3,000 grammar schools with 130 comprehensives. And then in 1990, you see that the number of grammar schools decreases to 150 with over 3,000 comprehensives. But obviously, this move to comprehensives did not solve all of the problems. It was a slow move. It was in pieces. It was slowly done over a period of 20 years. It was incoherent. Some of the grammar schools that were asked to change resisted this change, and they went into being private schools instead. And there was really no national planning for the replacement of grammars and moderns. And so what ended up happening was a very divided set of comprehensive schools. Some of the comprehensives were excellent, while the majority of them were not that great. And in 1976, just after the recession, which we have in 1974, Callaghan gave a famous speech known as the Ruskin speech. In this speech, he blamed the failure of education on teachers. He said that the standards of education were too low and they needed to be improved. Children needed to be given two goals that they should try and obtain: a lively, constructive place in society, and to do a job of work. He also told the teachers that we can no longer have a curriculum that isn't defined. We can't have the curriculum left to the teacher's definition. We now need to open this up. In what he said, we need to open up the secret garden of the curriculum. Okay? He was the first prime minister to actually suggest writing a curriculum. Again, the curriculum wasn't actually written under the Labour government of Callaghan. It was written much later in 1988 under Thatcher. But he was the first to suggest it. And this speech has been described as the end of the golden age of teacher control. So this is where teachers lost control of the education system. It was taken away from the teachers and moved to the government. So we then jump to 1988, where Thatcher released the 1988 Education Act. This was an extremely comprehensive education act. It basically replaced all of the previous education policy that was in place and set up a new policies. So it established a national curriculum that would entrench national subjects and British cultural heritage over misguided relativism and multiculturalism, in the words of Thatcher. Okay? So we've now got a curriculum being put into place. The need for systems of control and accountability over teachers, so some methods of controlling teachers, which was, of course, management molded on the type of managements that you find within businesses. And through these management structures, they wish to make the schools more business-like and more market-sensitive. So public examinations were used to identify poor schools and failing teachers. The GCSEs had just been introduced 2 years prior to the 1988 Education Act. So the CSEs and the O-levels had been replaced by the GCSEs, and these were now being used to produce a way of measuring the performance of schools. And lastly, there was a league table that was used to give parents choice on choosing which school to send their students to. And just to give you an insight into the way Margaret Thatcher thought, in a speech that she delivered on 1987 to the Conservative Party, she said, "Too often our children don't get the education they need, the education they deserve. And in the inner cities where youngsters must have a decent education if they are to have a better future, that opportunity is all too often snatched from them by hard-left educational authorities and extremist teachers. Children who need to be able to count and multiply are learning anti-racist mathematics, whatever that may be. Children who need to be able to express themselves in clear English are being taught political slogans. Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay." So this was the kind of rhetoric that Thatcher was using, this idea of a fear of the other. We want to create a national curriculum that makes sure that students are taught well-defined cultural values. So what we see after the 1988 Educational Act is an increase, firstly, in the private sector for the first time in the 1900s. The private sector grew from 5.8% in 1979 to 6.7% in 1991. 1 in 4 students from the state sector were managing to go to university, whilst from the private sector, it was almost the majority of students were going to university. In state schools, poverty and education failure were strongly correlated. If you had a school in an area of large poverty, then as a general whole, the students in that area would do extremely badly. And it was noticed by an Ofsted survey that state schools had a high concentration, the state schools that did have a high concentration of poor children would have a very bad performance at GCSEs. So, Labour government came in 1997 and they wished to turn this around. But Mr. Blair said some things that the Conservatives did, they got right, and he didn't want to change them. So, in essence, his policies were not there to completely reorient the Conservative policies. He wanted to take the Conservative policies, but remedy what had been neglected and what had been missed. And Mr. Major describes Blair's policies. He says, "I did not at the time appreciate the extent to which he would appropriate conservative language and steal our policies. The attractive candidate was to turn out to be a political kleptomaniac." So a lot of the policies that New Labour were pushing were actually very, very similar to the Conservative policies. Mr. Blair claims to have defined a third way. So it wasn't replacing the market, but to try and make sure that the market was working properly. And what this meant was producing a lot of policy to actually control the market and try and make sure that it functioned in the way that we wanted it to function. So in a green paper that was published in 2001 called "Schools Building on Success," a negative picture of education from 1944 to 1976 was painted. It was said that education had failed in that period, and there was little emphasis, if any at all, on improving education. The goal was rather set to improve social improvement rather than economic improvement. And because they were aiming for social improvement, it emphasized on egalitarianism rather than setting standards. And it went on to say that the teachers were the barrier to change. In order to actually make change, the teachers had to have all power taken away from them, and it had to be moved to central government. Standards had to be set centrally. And it said that the Conservative government had done an extremely good job of doing this. They had managed to take away the power from the teachers. But what they hadn't managed to do was ensuring that they had put policies in place that controlled the market. The Conservative government had also treated all children as being the same. The Labour government had a massive push on setting by ability. So Mr. Blair, one of his large policies that he pushed through was setting by ability in the majority of lessons. And Mr. Blair also focused on saying that we need to push standards significantly. Standards, in Mr. Blair's case, were specifically defined to be literacy and numeracy. Okay, it was literacy and numeracy that had to be improved. And there was a zero tolerance of underperformance. So what was set up was an Ofsted system where schools were observed at least once every 6 years, and any school that was failing would be forced to close down. Okay, this was the first time where Ofsted observations were taken, and if the school was found to be doing badly, they were forced to shut down. We then come to the coalition government in 2010 to the present, and Michael Gove, the Education Secretary, just to quote for you a little bit from a talk that he gave in 2012 to the Social Market Foundation, "Political progressivism demanded educational conservatism. The oppressed class should be taught to master the tools of power and authority, the ability to read, write, and communicate, and to gain enough traditional knowledge to understand the words of nature and culture surrounding them. Children, particularly the children of the poor, should not be encouraged to flourish naturally, which would keep them ignorant and make them slaves of emotion. They should learn the values of hard work, gain the knowledge that leads to understanding, and master the traditional culture in order to command its rhetoric. So what Mr. Gove sets out within a narrative, he says that education in the past has failed us. Education has gone down, what he says, is a progressive line. Progressive education, he says, is where children do whatever they want within the classroom. The teachers allow children to do whatever they want, and the children shape the education. That's what he says progressive education is. And this is what our past is defined by this progressive education. We need to now remove this progressive education and move to traditional, solid education, where the teacher stands at the front of the classroom, tells the students what to do, narrates, and the children listen and they learn. Okay? This is the kind of narrative that Michael Gove shapes of education. The politics that he pushes is the creation of the English baccalaureate, because all students should be learning 5 key subjects. So they must be taught these 5 key subjects. These 5 key subjects are English, mathematics, 1 foreign language, science, and history or geography. So they must be taught these 5 key subjects. He also pushes to create a new curriculum. And I think the curriculum is going to start this year for year 10 students. They will all now be pushed onto this new curriculum that has been put out. He says that we need to move back to British values. Again, what these British values are is difficult to define, but he says we need to move to British values, and within the curriculum that he's defining, he's tried to push for these British values. He's redefining the GCSEs and A-levels. He's completely removed the modular-based GCSEs and A-levels. It's now 1 exam at the end of your GCSE, 1 exam at the end of A-levels. The modular basing of the GCSEs and A-levels has been removed. The GCSEs are also planned to be removed completely, and they now want to move away from a grading system that's based on A star to whatever it goes down to, and they're moving to leveled education, so level 1 for highest, level 2, and so on. There's also a speak of resetting the targets which schools must meet with, and failing to meet these targets would mean that you would be taken over by other schools or academies. Okay, so certain targets have been set that all schools must meet, and these targets are based on the number of passes of exams. So students pass it, so there should be 35% of students doing this in your exams in English, this many doing this in your exams in maths, and so on. These kind of targets have been set, and if you fail to meet these targets, then the school would be taken over by other successful schools, or you'd be forced to change into an academy. And the academy being something where a private organization begins to control the school and runs the way that the school is governed. So we move on to the ideologies that are shaping the education policy in this way. One of the main ideologies that we see coming through is this idea of marketization, this neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an idea that's guided by a weak state. Okay? We want to make the state interfere as little as possible in everyone's lives, and we want to leave the markets to take the majority of the control. It believes that the private is good, whilst the public is bad. So anything being run by the public sector is bad, because something like a school or the NHS are defined as being black holes. You throw money in, money that should be given to the private sector, but it goes into the state sector, and so it's wasted finances. And markets are believed to be natural and neutral. They're governed by effort and merit. The more effort you put in, the better your outcome. Okay? They're completely neutral. It doesn't matter what kind of background you come from. As long as you put in the effort, you get the benefit. And all individuals are said to make rational choices, where the rational choice is doing what maximizes profit. Okay? So neoliberalism is something that we are seeing quite a lot of within state education. And the way that this has been done is interesting. One of the things that was pushed by Thatcher was the league tables. The league tables, interestingly, changed the very emphasis that education makes. Rather than saying students need, rather than saying we are focusing on the students' needs, we moved to saying we are focusing on the student's performance. Rather than saying, what does the school do for the student, we say, what does the student do for the school? Because what's happened is that in order for a student to choose a school, they have to look at the league table. They see which schools are doing the best. So if you have a student of a low ability, you don't particularly want that student because that student is going to hold you back. It's going to bring down your position in the league table. So students with special educational needs are now viewed as a burden. They're viewed as being expensive because the resources that have to be put to achieving the same results with lower ability students is higher. And because the resources that have to be put in are higher, they are then viewed as being a burden. But this doesn't just apply to special educational needs students. We also see this being applied to ethnic groups as well. Because there is a perceived image of certain ethnic groups achieving less or lower results than other ethnic groups. So these ethnic groups that are achieving lower results are also viewed as being a burden on the system. So these kind of students are now not really wanted by schools because you've moved to a model that looks at the student performance rather than trying to help the student as much as possible. So what we have to realize is that markets are not neutral. Markets cannot be neutral. To do well in a market, what you require is cultural capital. Okay, we have three types of capital. We have economic capital, which is our money, our property. All of these are economic capital. We have social capital, which are the relationships, the networks of influence we have, the support that we can take from our networks. All of these things are social capital. Then we have cultural capital. This is the forms of knowledge, the skills that we have, the education that we have been given, the advantages that people have given to them, and the kind of statuses that we build up in society. These form our cultural capital. And it's when we have these specific things, when we have the knowledge of how to navigate the market, when we have the skills needed to navigate the market, when we have the education that teaches us how to do these things, that we are able to do extremely well within a neoliberal economy. And social and economic capital can be used to create cultural capital. Okay, the middle-class parents are able to take this social and cultural capital and convert it into cultural capital. The way they do this is they have things like flexible hours, Okay, so they have more choice over which schools they send their children to. They're able to afford multiple cars, so both parents are able to drop their children to different schools if their children are of different ages. So the choice given to them by this system is greater, and they're able to make sure that their children go to the best possible schools. They're also able to access hidden cultural resources. For example, they can send their children to summer camps, after-school activities. All of these kind of things are very easy for them to get a hold of. And they also have informal knowledge which benefits them on methods of navigating the market. This informal knowledge comes from their connections and their networks. They're able to pick up this navigation of the market. So the middle class are extremely good at building this cultural capital within their children. Affluent parents are able to convert this social and this economic capital into cultural capital. And rather than class being passed on through families, it now begins to be passed on through schools. And this is a fundamental change that we must understand. The schools are where cultural capital is transferred. The schools end up collecting people of one economic class or of a very similar economic class, because a good school will have lots of people coming from the middle class and the higher class background, whilst the not so good schools will have children being sent to from poorer backgrounds. So the schools are where this cultural capital is actually transferred, where these networks are built. And what we see is by creating a competition with both hierarchy and division based on class and race, the general outline of the winners and losers has already been identified. Schools transfer the class divides. Another ideology that we see within education is neoconservatism. This is actually guided quite differently. This is guided by a vision of a very strong state. Okay? And it particularly wants to interfere within ideas of knowledge and values and morals. Okay? It has set ideas of knowledge, it has set values and set morals that it wants to make sure everyone believes in. The way that it normally works is by painting the past as a place where real knowledge and morality reigned supreme. Okay? The policies that are normally produced are those that advocate national and statewide curriculum, national and statewide testing, a return to higher standards, and a revival of Western tradition. But behind everything that neoconservatism believes in is a fear of others. Okay? We saw this recently in the Trojan horse fiasco that took place in Birmingham. A large fear of a community building up a different set of cultural values. So, who chooses which culture we have to follow? And neoconservatism says that we must follow one particular culture that it defines as Western culture or British culture. But in a multicultural society, how can you possibly decide what the dominant culture should be? the only way to take one culture over another is to say that your culture is supreme, is superior to the other culture. Okay? So how do you get teachers to make sure that they are teaching these set values, these set cultures? You have to subject them to greater scrutiny. You create a culture of terror. And the way that you do this is through what is known as performativity. It's constant performance management. You have appraisal meetings, you have annual reviews, report writing, quality assurance visits, regular publication of results, inspection after inspection after inspection, thousands of peer reviews. You increase considerably the amount of paperwork that the teacher has to fill in. You monitor constantly the way that the teacher is working so that they are so afraid of doing anything that is slightly away from this that they are forced into doing these fixed activities. They are forced into teaching in the way you want them to teach. They are forced into teaching what you want them to teach. And if they don't do it, then you have these structures, this constant monitoring that shows you this, and you either reduce their pay in performance-related pay, or you remove the staff completely. The effect of this is a reduction in the quality of teaching. Because so much time goes into filling out paperwork, completing all of these performance reviews, preparing for these inspections, that much less time goes into focusing on the most important part of the teaching, which is the direct engagement with the students, the lesson planning, and the marking. So, I want to just end with a short story. This is a story of children of a child in an American school. But the backing that he has in this American school is very similar to what we would see within the British system. Joseph sobbed at my desk. He was a tough kid, a hard case, someone who often made life difficult for his teachers. He was all of 9 years old, and here he was sobbing, holding on to me in public. He had been in my 4th grade class all year, a classroom situated in a decaying building in an East Coast city that was among the most impoverished in the nation. At times, I wondered seriously whether I would make it through that year. There were many Josephs in that classroom, and I was constantly drained by the demands, the bureaucratic rules, the daily lessons that bounced off the kids' armor. Yet somehow that year was satisfying, compelling, and important, even though the prescribed curriculum and the textbooks that were meant to teach it were often beside the point. They were boring to the kids and boring to me. I should have realized the first day what it would be like when I opened the city's Getting Started suggested lessons for the first few days, and it began with the suggestion that, as a new teacher, I should circle the students' desks and have them introduce each other and tell something about themselves. It's not that I was against this activity, it's just that I didn't have enough unbroken desks or even chairs for all the students. A number of the kids had nowhere to sit. This was my first lesson, but certainly not my last, in understanding that the curriculum and those who planned it lived in an unreal world, a world fundamentally disconnected from my life with those children in that inner city classroom. But here's Joseph. He's still crying. I've worked extremely hard with him all year long. We've eaten lunch together. We've read stories. We've gotten to know each other. There are times when he drives me to despair, and other times when I find him to be among the most sensitive children in my class. I just can't give up on this kid. He's just received his report card, and it says that he is to repeat 4th grade. The school system has a policy that states that failure in any 2 subjects, including the behavior side of the report card, requires that the student be left back. Joseph was failing gym and arithmetic. Even though he had shown improvement, he had trouble staying awake during arithmetic, had done poorly on the mandatory citywide tests, and hated gym. One of his parents worked a late shift, and Joseph would often stay up, hoping to spend some time with her. And the things that students were asked to do in gym were to him lame. The thing is, he had made real progress during the year, but I was instructed to keep him back. I knew that things would be worse next year. There would still not be enough desks. The poverty in that community would still be horrible, and healthcare and sufficient funding for job training and other services would be diminished. I knew that the available jobs in this former mill town paid deplorable wages, and that even with both of his parents working for pay, Joseph's family income was simply insufficient. I also knew that, given all that I already had to teach day in the classroom and each night at home in preparation for the next day, it would nearly be impossible for me to work any harder than I had already done with Joseph. And there were another 5 children in that class whom I was supposed to leave back. So Joseph sobbed. Both he and I understood what this meant. There would be no additional help for me or for children such as Joseph next year. The promises would remain simply rhetorical. Words would be thrown at the problems. Teachers and parents and children would be blamed. But the school system would look like it believed in and enforced higher standards. The structuring of economic and political power in that community and that state would again go on as business as usual. The next year, Joseph basically stopped trying. The last time I heard anything about him was that he was in prison.